Data sensitivity is what's important. And Volatus does well over, I think we're close to 1.7 million kilometers of pipeline surveillance that we do every year in terms of linear inspections. We get to do things that are uniquely Canadian, everything from autonomy to Arctic operations as an Arctic nation. There's a lot of things that Canada can bring to the table. And I think that that's more what this is about.
There is a pretty significant shift happening in aerospace and defense right now, and it's happening far beyond the headlines about drones. Governments are moving from talking about autonomous systems as emerging technology to treating them as strategic capability. Canada is looking at sovereign manufacturing. NATO allies are accelerating defense spending. The Arctic is becoming a much bigger security conversation, and militaries are increasingly interested in systems that can actually operate in the field, collect intelligence, adapt, and integrate into existing defense infrastructure. And that puts companies like Volatus Aerospace in a very interesting position because Volatus is no longer simply making the case for drones. The company has expanded into aerospace operations, autonomous systems, aerial intelligence, defense and training, manufacturing, counter-drone technology, and proprietary software. They have a 53,000 square foot manufacturing and systems integrated facility they just opened in Mirabel. They have advanced through the U.S. drone dominance program, expanded NATO-related work, and they've launched Skydra. And they've also increasingly talking about something much bigger than selling individual aircraft. They're talking about sovereign capability. And yet, at the same time, the market is asking some pretty tough questions about what that transformation ultimately means for the company and its shareholders. Welcome to the Market Frontlines. I'm your host, Lyndsay Malchuk, and Glen Lynch is back with us. Glen is the CEO of Volatus Aerospace, and he has spent years watching this industry evolve from a relatively niche technology story into something increasingly tied to national security, defense spending, and the future of aerospace. Glen, it's so great to have you back with us.
Lyndsay, nice to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, as mentioned, you have spent a lot of time saying Volatus is not a drone company. Now, I wonder if the bigger question is whether you've actually become too many things at once for people to understand. So you're in aviation, drones, autonomy, manufacturing, defense, training, software, and intelligence. What is the one business inside Volatus that you think maybe ultimately becomes the economic engine of this company?
Well, to understand Volatus, there's a couple of key parts. First of all, we present ourselves as a platform, and the breadth of our capability has to do with kind of our roots. We were born as an aerospace company. We executed a roll-up strategy that gave us some breadth in terms of capability and geographic footprint. And ultimately, we've established ourselves more as an aerospace platform than a collection of products and capabilities. So we have the ability to design. We're developing. Our engineering department is growing continuously. We've got the ability to manufacture, which is new as of 2026. We actually stood the factory up or took the keys to the factory at the end of February. That's really in response to the defense industrial strategy and the increasing defense spending requirements. We also train. We provide training out of Canada, the US, and the UK. And we operate. We're operating across Canada, through the United States, and in Europe on a regular basis, flying beyond visual line of sight flights. Matter of fact, we do about 16 flights a day out closer to you in Edmonton with drones flown in and out of the Edmonton airport that are operated from Toronto. So we've got a pretty broad-based capability, and think of it as two parallel growth engines, meaning our industrial civil market alongside of the emerging defense market, all operating on a single platform. When we scale our capabilities, or when we introduce new capabilities in our operating model, it scales across both civil, industrial, and defense markets.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because, it actually gets into something you've been talking about a lot lately, and that's sovereignty. So you've said that products are temporary, but capability creates that sovereignty. That is a very different proposition from simply selling an aircraft. But there's an interesting tension here, Glen. Governments can absolutely want sovereign capability and still buy very differently than commercial customers. So are you building a business that can scale commercially, or are you increasingly building a company that depends on governments deciding what Canada's strategic priorities are?
So I think both of those are two different subjects for us that are operating
Okay.
again in parallel. Our industrial commercial business, as regulations evolve and our technologies, drones are thought of as very small items. And if you witnessed our announcements recently, we announced a a new aircraft platform we're bringing to Canada with our partners. That's a 4,000 kilogram platform that's closer to the size of a school bus for wildfire suppression and remote deliveries. These are advanced technologies that fit in our operating world. We operate both piloted aircraft and helicopters, about 28 of those on top of our drone fleet. Well, the reality is where the pilot sits is the only difference between a drone and
That's
a
so
what we
true.
think of as more traditional aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
So drones and aircraft are the same thing to us. It's just
Mm-hmm.
pilots operate differently or from a different location, and the regulatory environment in them is different. Although that's converging as the drones become larger and as regulators become more comfortable with the emerging technologies. So from our standpoint, they really are both emerging in parallel. Now, the defense side, obviously, there's a massive opportunity in defense. Volatus was not in the business of building our own drones on at scale. We were building our own aircraft such as the Canary and some of the other product projects that we'd worked on the industrial side. But what's changed is the Canadian government's commitment under the Defense Industrial Strategy and the Build Partner Buy framework, and ultimately their commitment to start buying Canadian, which is something that the market is still waiting to see the procurement happen.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, that's the thing that's caused the dramatic refocusing on Canada because there's a much fewer number of well-capitalized competitors in Canada. There's great technologies, but at the end of the day, Canada represents an immediate opportunity for us with the direction of the current government and the current defense industrial strategy.
You make a good point there too. Canada is committed to buying Canada or Canadian, and I think that doesn't just go in your sector, but it goes across all sectors right now. I mean, you see it across the world that so many countries are now stockpiling and keeping things within the country where they can supply that at their demand and not have to wait for someone else. So I think it's a very strategic move that you guys are aligning where you're aligning right now. And given everything we've seen this summer, like, I don't know if you can see it not too much behind me, but the smoke is insane here in Vancouver. And we're hit from Washington, we're hit from the Okanagan, we're hit from all sorts of places. And, if you can have a spot in there to relieve some of that forest fire pressure, and you have a solution that could help that, I mean, anything right now, because this is becoming a regular thing every summer now. So do you see that over there in Ontario as well?
We do. It's a cross Canada problem. As a matter of fact, it's becoming a global issue, but it certainly will focus on Canada for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The most recent announcements that we've made around this space were actually inspired heavily by a visit we had with our Minister of Defense, David McGuinty, and General Molstad, the commander of the Joint Forces Command for Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And during the tour of our facility in Montreal, the Minister of Defense asked me what autonomous systems could do to help alleviate some of the problems that we're having with our forest industry. And Volatus was already well advanced in that space. The Wildfire initiative with the two new aircraft that we're introducing for that, really, while we're presenting it as our wildfire intelligence and rapid response shield, the truth of the matter is it's really wildfire is the first use case in a general capability that has to do with dual use technologies that can be deployed for, delivering 1,500 liters of fire suppressant or water to an early strike on fires,
Right.
or delivering uh, supplies to critical areas in disaster recovery or some of our Indigenous communities, not even Indigenous communities, just Northern Canadian communities, supporting our Canadians up to the north at times where they're difficult. But the key point here is, at one point this summer, we literally had more than 1,000 um, wildfires burning in the country. And less than half of the number of aircraft quantities, less than half the number of fires that were burning. So we didn't even have one aircraft for every fire, and that's because it's almost unpredictable, right? We've got increasingly dry conditions. We've got the fires are bigger, they're more intense. What we've introduced is the ability to use intelligence, starting with satellites and partnerships with satellite companies to get early information on where the danger areas are, introducing persistent surveillance up close using drones and aircraft to be able to actually monitor and identify ignition faster,
Yes.
catch the fires in the early phase. And then the goal is to be able to deploy an autonomous aircraft that can fly day or night, because that's a limitation with wildfire because the danger to the pilots and so
Yep.
on. But we can deploy an autonomous aircraft, hopefully with the goal of seeing the fires earlier, analyzing, responding more quickly, and reducing the number of fires that our talented and brave firefighters across the country are actually fighting. Our goal is definitely to supplement and make their lives easier. There's no way to replace
Totally.
what they're doing right now.
Totally.
This is an added layer of defense for our provinces and for our nation as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger picture here is how can we all collaboratively come together and really battle this, because that is a lot of pressure on these first responders to get up there and do it and all the things. I think what people don't understand is the size of your drones. These are not little tiny drones that we all see flying around and taking pictures. This is not it. I remember being in your facility. It's the size of a helicopter. Like this is not a little toy that we're playing with. And the fact that you guys can remotely pilot these from Ontario, from wherever, where you're not having to be in there, that is phenomenal. Phenomenal. And it's proactive to be on top of to help this situation up in the north right now. So I applaud you, and I hope to see that those contracts are going to come in faster, because this is not going away. Absolutely not.
Lyndsay, I would tell you the government engagement on the wildfire activities right now has been extremely encouraging, both at a federal and a provincial level. Uh, Time will tell where that goes. I think the key thing that I'd like to bring up quickly is the procurement in the defense industrial strategy. I know there's a lot of people that are disappointed, including in our industry, that procurement's not happening faster. But the reality is the Defense Investment Agency is functioning as a unit within another department. And until the legislation passes to make its own standalone ministry, which will happen after Parliament resumes this fall, and they appoint their own minister, there's only so much progress they can make. In the meantime, the Canadian Armed Forces has extraordinary engagement with industry right now, helping industry understand their challenges while industry is demonstrating to the Canadian Armed Forces what's possible. And that leads into, most recently, we had um, the Drone Defense Initiative, we call it DDI, which was launched by the Joint Forces Command, General Molstad. And it's extraordinary the speed that it's moving. It was just a few weeks ago, they announced the initiative. The application for 5 work streams actually closes in the next 48 hours. And with that, they're creating supplier arrangements to be able to accelerate procurement. This has all been developed quickly, deployed quickly. Canadian industry, including Volatus, is responding quickly. That's putting the procurement pathways in place. Volatus is participating at every possible defense. I've been personally at 2 defense events this week. We were in Quebec City, understanding the Arctic and the military capability and challenges in the Arctic. And then we were at Area XO out west of Ottawa, where we were actually engaged directly with the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Joint, or the Commander of Joint Forces, and the Canadian Armed Forces in general, really reviewing technologies, looking at what the possibilities are. And this is going on a weekly basis right now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
while the public can't necessarily see the velocity of what's happening, a lot of what they're seeing in Volatus is preparing for what's coming, engaging actively with Canadian Armed Forces, with the government, with the Defense Investment Agency, and ultimately preparing for what comes next. Procurement contracts are coming. They are definitely not here yet. Any procurement that's happening at the moment in the drone industry, and I want to qualify that specifically around drones, they're not quite there yet, but they're getting there fast.
They are, absolutely. So, speaking of events, I know that this one just happened yesterday. The Canadian Armed Forces held the Red Cobalt in the Ottawa Valley. So, that was
Yep.
bringing, I think, military personnel together with drone and autonomous systems where companies could actually test their technologies and get direct feedback from the people who could ultimately be using them. So, that feels like a pretty meaningful change in the way Canada, as you said, is approaching this industry. Does an event like Red Cobalt change the game for companies like Volatus? I mean, is this the Canadian military's way of moving into asking what can this technology do and quicker for us? Or, are they saying, put it in front of us and let's prove it?
It's not just Volatus. I want to say that right off the bat. Obviously, we're here talking about Volatus, but what they're doing is changing the way they deal with industry.
Yeah.
It's affecting. I was at that event you're talking about, Red Cobalt. I was there yesterday.
Is it good?
I was fortunate enough that the CEO of Invest Ottawa and Area XO invited us there as VIPs. So I was there with our vice president of corporate affairs
Awesome.
and engaged. We were engaged most of the day with most senior defense staff. The Minister of Defense was there, key members of his staff. The armed forces presence and access was extraordinary. It was an invitation event. So it was at a remote location that's one of the development sites of Invest Ottawa. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to engage directly. What's happening right now is we're building relationships. We're creating solutions to the problems that CAF is helping us understand with technologies that we're helping them understand as an industry. And obviously for Volatus, we're deploying everything we have, both to be part of that process, to build the relationships, build the capabilities that the government's going to want, and to be there. The example, we've had a team working since the initial announcement of the Drone Defense Initiative on preparing the submission, which actually goes in today for us, which will hopefully qualify Volatus in most, if not all, of the work streams, which will give us accelerated access or accelerated privileged position amongst a smaller number of suppliers as the government starts their actual procurement exercises, which we expect to start. The RFPs, the actual RFPs for what the government's looking for are starting to flow. We're expecting that we'll start seeing them in a material way starting in September.
That's right. Well, I think that leads into something I find really actually more interesting about where you've taken Volatus. I mean, you now have that manufacturing facility in Mirabel, proprietary autonomy technology. You have the defense relationships and international ambitions, all that you spoke about. I'm going to push you on a little further on where the real value ultimately sits. I mean, at what point does Volatus stop being an integrator of other people's technology and you become an aerospace technology company whose own intellectual property is the thing customers actually come to buy?
I think we can do a better job describing where we are there. And that's on me at the moment.
Yeah.
First of all, I believe we're there now. We'll
Okay.
continue to increase our presence there at CANSEC this year, the Canadian Defense event sponsored by CADSI in Ottawa this spring. We launched Vortex AI, which is that's our autonomy system where we have our own flight controller, our own hardware, firmware, communications, encryption protocol, our autonomy stack, all of the tactical nodes that go with that to be able to operate in a multi-domain platform agnostic environment. So we own those technologies. We have a number of aircraft technologies. Some we've developed ourselves, some we've acquired.
Yeah.
And ultimately, our goal here, though, is to recognize that, build, partner, buy. Well, that's the government policy. I think of it as a firing order. They buy where they can from Canadian firms. Then they buy from Canadian firms and partner organizations. And then ultimately, if they need supplies, our soldiers and warfighters need tools. So they buy from whoever will supply them what we need. But that's the firing order. The key point is no company nor any nation should or can build everything, right? We need to do what we can to create that independence. So we've got our sovereign capability. We need to be a contributor to our allied partners, as well as being a supplier to the Canadian Armed Forces. Because largely, as our Prime Minister stated, Canada has been a consumer of defense technologies as opposed to a capability partner. And what's happening now is a shift towards investing in our defense industrial base, which also makes it more sustainable, right? We can't spend tens of billions of dollars outside of the country without building an industry within the country to recycle those
So
investments
true.
and
So
build on
true.
our own economy. That said, if you look at a 30% spend in 2035 that will be outside of Canada versus a 70% spend that's outside of Canada today, based on the increase in defense spending, we're still going to be spending more money with our partners outside of Canada than we do inside of Canada or outside of Canada today. The difference is we'll be repatriating tens of billions of dollars into the Canadian industry and the Canadian economy. I think that's where real value starts to come. I think the value right now, the markets they don't know what to think because, of course, everybody says, the current government said they're going to spend money, they're going to buy drones, they're going to do all those things. Well, it's not the snap of a finger. There's a capability, there's a connection with the military, there's a defense understanding what it can get, an industry understanding what the Canadian Armed Forces needs. That's where we are right now in the process while they're standing up the procurement mechanisms. So I think you're going to see that the real heavier procurements are most likely to occur in 2027 and beyond, although you will start seeing procurement this year for sure. But I think what's happening more today than anything is investment by the government in Canadian capability, right? Actually building the capability and capacity that they need within Canada, including reinforcing our supply chains and building stronger relations with like-minded allies. And I just want to add one more thing, Lyndsay, and that has to do with, some concerns people have said about us doing this to create independence from the United States. That's not the way I see it at all. The United States wants burden sharing, and to share the burden of changing global geopolitics, you have to have domestic capability to bring to the table. Canada only brought capability through our Canadian Armed Forces that we procured from somewhere else. By building an industry, we get to contribute to do things that are uniquely Canadian, everything from autonomy to Arctic operations as an Arctic nation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that Canada can bring to the table. And I think that that's more what this is about. It's building an industrial base that can actually allow Canada to become a much bigger contributor both to ourselves and to the security of our allied partners.
Okay, so I have a question for you. How much of the original thesis of the company has changed? I mean, you have been in this industry long enough to have seen a lot of predictions about where drones, autonomy, and aerial intelligence were going. So, I want to ask you something that CEOs don't always get asked. What has turned out to be completely wrong about your original thesis? Not what surprised you, what were you simply wrong about?
I would have to say there was two mistakes that I see, and hindsight's 2020, right?
Yeah, of course.
We
This is
were
how we
very
learn.
much focused on industrial commercial growth. We were supplying to Ukraine. We've been actively involved in the support of Ukraine, but largely using commercial products that we packaged and resold or integrated and resold out of our UK operations. That was largely because it's hard to sell technologies to Germany when Canada doesn't buy. If Canada doesn't buy from a Canadian company, why would a German government buy from a Canadian
Touche.
company? So that was one thing. The second thing is domestic capability and domestic capacity didn't matter as much before because it was okay if we bought our products from Southeast Asia. Now that's all changed, right? We're looking for stronger national defense in the face of changing global geopolitics. We have a current government that's made this a priority. I think the world for Volatus started spinning slightly differently in June of last year when the Prime Minister stepped up and said we will hit our 2% commitment for NATO and we will grow beyond to our 3.5% and 5%. So, but for us, I think we weren't interested in building manufacturing capacity in Canada because economically it was very difficult to compete with the technology and value proposition that came from Southeast Asia because sovereignty was less of a concern. When it became a concern, that actually said, okay, building in Canada is now important and we have the ability to do that. I have a manufacturing background, so too do several of our key executives. But the second part was recognizing that defense was going to be a major part of our business. Now, it's not, I won't say that it's a mistake in that case. There's probably under the circumstances that existed in those days, back in the earlier days of Volatus, defense wasn't a big thing for us.
Hmm.
What's happened now is a lot of what we were building on the industrial commercial side is exactly the things that have been prioritized on the government and defense side. So when you talk about, let's talk about border surveillance, just to make it something simple. Whether we are patrolling a border or controlling a pipeline, it's very similar. It's what you use the data for. It's data sensitivity is what's important. And Volatus does well over, I think we're close to 1.7 million kilometers of pipeline surveillance that we do every year in terms of linear inspections. So the reality is whether we're inspecting a pipeline, a power line, or a border, or a shoreline, and whether we're delivering medical supplies between two hospitals in Oakville, or we're delivering fire suppressant to a wildfire, or dropping cargo into remote communities, it's very similar to what we've done on the civil industrial side. What's happened is the technologies have evolved, the regulators have evolved, and our own abilities as a company and our experience has evolved. So again, I think the miscalculation came from, or the error came from, not knowing the world was about to change.
Oh my gosh,
And
yeah.
and that's the biggest thing that we've learned.
Well, I'm going to push on the tension that the investors are showing a little bit right now, because strategically, Volatus, the story has arguably never been more interesting. And you know, we touched on this for sure. The defense opportunity is expanding. Canada is talking more seriously about sovereign capability. Autonomous systems are becoming much more important. And you do have that manufacturing, the software, the intelligence, and the defense applications all sitting under the same roof now. Now, Glen, the stock has not reflected that confidence. And this is where investors are going, wait, what? And so I don't want to ask you the usual question about why investors are impatient. What do you think the market fundamentally does not understand about Volatus right now?
I would say there's a few things. First of all, I think you need to look at our history. The our stock performs in big chunks, right? Like we were
Okay.
a top performing stock on the venture exchange, or one of the top performing stocks on the venture exchange in 2025. And I think a lot changed over the last year. Volatus is really positioning itself to take advantage of those changes. Many of those things won't be translated into financial results until a few quarters pass, right? Some of them have already passed, some of them we're in the middle of them now. It's positioning for the changing environment. I think investors want to see big contracts. I think sometimes investors are impatient, as they should be, right? They're looking for those big results. We're all looking for them. They don't have the visibility that I do into what's actually happening behind that. The biggest thing that I usually say to investors when they look at it is Volatus has a high percentage of insider holdings. Myself and our chairman are two of the biggest holders in the company, and neither one of us have ever sold a single share.
Hmm.
That's because, we're not in a sprint, we're in a marathon, and our strategies are carefully thought out. We have a brilliant CFO, very deliberate actions that become available. It would be wonderful to talk about all the things that we're working on, but as a public company, we can't, right?
Right.
We talk about the things that we can, we communicate to the best of our ability. What I hope is that investors that are really interested dig a little deeper, look at the comparables. Canada has traded at a discount to our American counterparts
Yes.
forever. It's one of the draws to the US market, right? I think also one other thing that's impacting our stock value, other than the fact that the government is not issuing big purchase orders and we can't make big announcements that will have those headlines, at least not yet. We're certainly working hard to make sure that we've got more than our fair share of that. But the other thing that happens is Volatus is maturing as a company. We've brought on some very, very capable and experienced communications professionals that are helping us mature our communications. The one problem when you're a small cap retail based backed company, you make lots of press releases, right? You're always talking. People want to know, it's really early phase. But as you get more mature, you now got to make sure that your announcements are more strategic. Make sure that we're not disclosing information that could competitively disadvantage us. And sometimes that can seem like we're less active than we were before.
Right.
but we've just stood up a 53,000 square foot facility, right? We've expanded our offering into larger aircraft. We had the first aircraft, the first complete remotely piloted aircraft system to pass the Transport Canada pre-validated declaration with in-flight traffic collision avoidance. They call it detect and avoid capabilities. And that was done in the last few weeks. People don't really understand what that means until that starts translating into meaningful contracts. And I think that that's where the impatience is. The only thing I can say is, like I said, I'm the biggest shareholder and I'm not impatient at all.
Well, I mean, you have that inside scoop, so you do see a little bit more. And I think, one of the things that we hear, the feedback from some of the investors is they want to see you come forward. And if there is a big announcement from defense or there is a big announcement from the government, that you're coming forward and you're saying, yeah, we know about this announcement and here's how that's going to affect Volatus. So I think communication is definitely key. Transparency, obviously, is definitely key. And we're going to see where that goes. So I think this is where we should leave it, Glenn.
Thanks very much. Lyndsay, I would say anybody that's interested in getting more information, definitely follow us online.
100%.
Because while we've been more strategic about our press releases, our volume of communication on social media is exponentially higher than it was.
It definitely
And
is.
people can see the level of our engagement and where our people are. They need ultimately to kind of connect some of those dots that we can't publicly talk about. We can talk about who we're seeing and perhaps what, if people are conscious of what's going on and understand the people that we're seeing, that might start to explain some of those. But we really do hope that, over the weeks and months ahead, people are actually going to see how the investment and effort that we're making ultimately pays off. So really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Appreciate the opportunity to share all of that.
Totally. And thank you again for joining us and just taking a deeper exploration behind all the headlines. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lyndsay.
Again, that was Glen Lynch, the CEO of Volatus Aerospace, which trades on the TSX under FLT and on the U.S. listing under TAKOF. And for everyone watching, maybe the question worth walking away with this is, in a market where technology can move at the speed of innovation, how long does it take for the capital markets to truly catch up? Because eventually the technology has to prove itself, the contracts have to turn into revenue, and the story has to show up in the numbers. And this is where the real front lines are. I'm Lyndsay Malchuk, your host. This is the Market Frontlines. And don't forget to subscribe and stay in the know of what's happening here and so much more. We'll see you next time.